Okay, let's get started, everyone. A couple of housekeeping notes about the schedule before we get started. Next Monday and Tuesday, I'm going to be at a meeting in Chicago, so I will not be here. You will have another guest lecturer who will carry on and bring you almost to the end of our second theme on issues of design as it relates to interactive systems. Since I will not be here on Monday and Tuesday, I will not be here for my office hours on Monday, but the TA will be holding her office hours if you need her for deliverable 4 and starting in on deliverable 5 next Tuesday. So usually we talk about the new deliverable on Tuesday. We're going to just jump a little bit ahead. I'm going to talk very briefly for a moment about deliverable 5. I know you're not there yet. Hopefully most of you are making good progress on deliverable 4. Any questions about deliverable 4? All good? All our installation headaches are behind us, right? Hopefully. Okay. Okay. Deliverable 5, things start to get even more fun now. So we're going to expand out to all 10 digits of ASL. And in deliverable 5, at the beginning of deliverable 5, you should be able to find your name somewhere in this table. If you don't see your name in this table, send me or the TA an email and we will add it. Each of you is being assigned 2 of the ASL digits. And in the process of deliverable 5, next week when you work your way through it, you're going to be recording 1,000 frames of your first digit to be used as training data, a second set of 1,000 frames for the same digit that are going to serve as the test data. You'll recall our discussion about the KNN algorithm last class. We need training data for the KNN algorithm, and it uses the training data to then make guesses about test data. So we're going to have 1,000 frames of the first digit for training, 1,000 frames of testing data for the first digit, and then the same thing for your second digit. 1,000 frames sounds like a lot of frames. Luckily, you're not going to be capturing 1,000 frames this way. We're going to be altering the recording a little bit. So we turn recording on, and my system is now capturing 1,000 frames of me signing the digit 0. And then after it's captured 1,000 digits, after it's captured 1,000 frames, your recorder will just exit. And then you'll go back to recording. Then you'll record another 1,000 frames of your second digit, and so on. You'll notice in this video that I have my palm facing down towards the device. This is something that we talked about before. But as I'm recording my gesture, I'm rotating my hand a little bit. There was a question after class about this on Tuesday. Why am I rotating my hand a little bit as I'm recording the 1,000 frames of 0?
To introduce variation into the data.
To introduce variation into the data, right? We're going to have, I think, about 59 sets of data coming back from all of you. You all have hands that vary in size and shape and geometry and skin tone and so on, and also orientation and position. So the big challenge in deliverable 6, we're going to take all of this data that you generate in deliverable 5. The TA is going to package it into one big data set and send that back out to you to use in deliverable 6. The big challenge in deliverable 6 is training your KNN algorithm to try and handle all of the diversity in this combined data set. I'm going to try and make things as easy as we can on KNN, and one way to do that is to make sure that your KNN algorithm is seeing all 10 digits signed by different hands in different orientations, different positions, righties, lefties, male hands, female hands, and so on. Any questions about that? No? Okay. I think deliverable 5 is relatively straightforward. Okay, so let's go back to lecture. We're working our way through the sequence of design. We spent the first part of this course talking about pact analysis, people, activities, context, and technology. We'll come back to pact analysis in lecture 7, which we may or may not get to today. We'll see. Might get bumped till next time. What are the specific aspects of design that relate to HCI? Well, one important aspect of design that straddles the objective and subjective is visual design. We have a large mass of data, and we're trying to think about what people want to do with that data. So again, we're still thinking about packed analysis. We have people that are trying to reason about the data. There's a flood of raw data out there, and what our group of observers or people would like to do is to be able to reason about that data and find patterns in that data. And the first step in that process is visualization, right? You just finished visualizing the data that you're capturing from your hand. You just spent some time, or you are spending some time developing a visualization to see how well KNN handles the data that you provide to it. Visualization is the first step. Once you start to reason about that data, we can move on to machine learning and analyzing and filtering and reducing and so on, right? So first step for a lot of HCI applications is showing the data to the user in the right way. And the tricky part is that in the right way. What do we mean by in the right way? So, as promised, we're going to watch one of the very first TED Talks by Hans Rosling, a very famous statistician, who wanted to take the growing mass of health and wealth data being collected by the United Nations and other NGOs around the world, pull all that data together and make it available to the public so that the public could understand relations or discover relationships between health and wealth, start to reason about it, perhaps lobby for new policy, and so on. So how do we visualize the vast amount of data that exists about health and wealth from countries around the world? As I mentioned, as we watch this TED video, I want you to write down all the strategies that either Rosling mentions explicitly or implicitly in the presentation that he makes, where he tried to alter or design those visualizations to make this process as easy as possible. How much data can we present to the public and help them to reason about that data?
About 10 years ago, I took on the task to teach global development to Swedish undergraduate students. That was after having spent about 20 years together with African institutions studying hunger in Africa. So I was sort of expected to know a little about the world. And I started in our medical university, Karolinska Institute, an undergraduate course called Global Health. But when you get that opportunity...
Can you guys hear that in the back? So. I've got subtitles on, but you probably can't see the subtitles.
You get a little nervous. I thought these students coming to us actually have the high...
What's that? It's coming out of my laptop. I can't get it to come out of the speakers. Hopefully the subtitles will help here.
About 10 years ago, I took on the task to teach global development to Swedish undergraduate students. That was after having spent about 20 years together with African institutions studying hunger in Africa. So I was sort of expected to know a little about the world. And I started in our medical university, Karolinska Institute, an undergraduate course called Global Health. But when you get that opportunity, you get a little nervous. I thought these students coming to us actually have the highest grade you can get in Swedish college system. So I thought maybe they know everything I'm going to teach them about. So I did a pre-test when they came. And one of the questions from which I learned a lot was this one: which country has the highest child mortality of these 5 pairs? And I put them together so that in each pair of country, one has twice the child mortality of the other. And this means that it's much bigger the difference than the uncertainty of the data. I won't put you at a test here, but it's Turkey, which is highest there, Poland, Russia, Pakistan, and South Africa. And these were the results of the Swedish students. I did it so I got a confidence interval, which was pretty narrow, and I got happy, of course. I had 1.8 right answer out of 5 possible. That means that there was a place for a professor of international health and for my course. But one late night, when I was compiling the report, I really realized my discovery. I have shown that Swedish top students know statistically significantly less about the world than the chimpanzees. Because the chimpanzee would score half right. If I gave them 2 bananas with Sri Lanka and Turkey, they would be right half of the cases. But the students are not there. The problem for me was not ignorance, it was preconceived ideas. I did also an unethical study of the professors of the Karolinska Institute that hands out the Nobel Prize in medicine, and they are on par with the chimpanzee there. So this is where I realized that there was really a need to communicate, because the data of what's happening in the world and the child health of every country is very well aware. So we did this software which displays it like this. Every bubble here is a country. This country over here is, this is China. This is India. The size of the bubble is the population. And on this axis here, I put fertility rate. Because my students, what they said when they looked upon the world, and I asked them, what do you really think about the world? Huh? Well, I first discovered that their textbook was Tintin mainly. And they said the world is still we and them. And we is Western world, and them is third world. And what do you mean with Western world? I said, well, that's long life in small family, and third world is short life in large family. So this is what I could display here. I put fertility rate here, number of children per woman, 1, 2, 3, 4, up to about 8 children per woman. We have very good data since 1960 about, on the size of families in all countries. The error margin is narrow. Here I put life expectancy at birth, from 30 years in some countries up to about 70 years. And 1962, there was really a group of countries here that was industrialized countries, and they had small families and long lives. And these were the developing countries. They had large families and they had relatively short lives. Now, what has happened since 1962? We want to see the change. Are the students right? It's still 2 types of countries? Or have these developing countries got smaller families and they live here? Or have they got longer lives and live up there? Let's see. We stop the world. And this is all UN statistic that has been available. Here we go. Can you see there? It's China. They're moving against better health. They're improving there. All the green Latin American countries, they are moving towards smaller families. The yellow ones here are the Arabic countries, and they get larger families, but longer life, but not larger families. The Africans are the green down here. They still remain here. This is India. Indonesia is moving on pretty fast. And in the 80s here, you have Bangladesh still among the African countries there. But now Bangladesh, it's a miracle that happens in the 80s. The imams start to promote family planning, and they move up into that corner. And in 90s, we have the terrible HIV epidemic that takes down the life expectancy of the African countries, and all the rest of the world moves up into the corner where we have long lives and small family, and we have a completely new world. Let me make a comparison directly between United States of America and Vietnam. 1964. America had small families and long life. Vietnam had large families and short lives. And this is what happens. The data during the war indicate that even with all the death, there was an improvement of life expectancy. By the end of the year, the family planning started in Vietnam, and they went for smaller families. And the United States up there is getting for longer life, keeping family size. And in the 80s now, they give up communist planning and they go for market economy, and it moves faster even than social life. And today we have in Vietnam the same life expectancy and the same family size here in Vietnam 2003 as in United States 1974 by the end of the war. I think we all, if we don't look in the data, we underestimate the tremendous change in Asia, which was in social change before we saw the economical change. So let's move over to another way here in which we could display the distribution in the world of the income. This is the world distribution of income of people. $1, $10, or $100 per day. There's no gap between rich and poor any longer. This is a myth. There's a little hump here. But there are people all the way. And if we look where the income ends up, the income, this is 100% of world's annual income, and the richest 20%, they take out of that about 74%, and the poorest 20%, they take about 2%. And this shows that the concept developing countries is extremely doubtful. We sort of think about aid like these people here giving aid to these people here. But in the middle, we have most of the world population, and they have now 24% of the income. We heard it in other forms. And who are these? Where are the different countries? I can show you Africa. This is Africa. 10% of world population, most in poverty. This is OECD, the rich country, the country club of the UN. And they are over here on this side, and quite an overlap between Africa and OECD. And this is Latin America. It has everything on this earth, from the poorest to the richest in Latin America. And on top of that, we can put East Europe, we can put East Asia, and we put South Asia. And how did it look like if we go back in time to about 1970? Then there was more of a hump. And we have most who lived in absolute poverty were Asians. The problem in the world was the poverty in Asia. And if I now let the world move forward, you will see that while population increase, there are hundreds of millions in Asia getting out of poverty, and some others get into poverty. And this is the pattern we have today, and the best projection from the World Bank is that this will happen. And we will not have a divided world. We will have most people in the middle. Of course, it's a logarithmic scale here, but our concept of economy is growth with percent. We look upon it as a possibility of percentage increase. If I change these and I take GDP per capita instead of family income, and I turn these individual data into regional data of gross domestic product, and I take the regions down here, the size of the bubble is still the population, and you have the OECD there, and you have sub-Saharan Africa there, and we take off the Arab states there, coming both from Africa and from Asia, and we put them separately, and we can expand this axis, and I can give it a new dimension here by adding the social values there, child survival. Now I have money on that axis, and I have the possibility of children to survive there. In some countries, 99.7% of children survive to 5 years of age, others only 70. And here it seems that there is a gap between OECD, Latin America, East Europe, East Asia, Arab states, South Asia, and Sub-Saharan Africa. The linearity is very strong between child survival and money. But let me split Sub-Saharan Africa. Health is there, and better health is up there. I can go here and I can split Sub-Saharan Africa into its countries. And when it bursts, the size of each country bubble is the size of the population. Sierra Leone down there, Mauritius up there. Mauritius was the first country to get away with trade barriers, and they could sell their sugar, they could sell their textiles on equal terms as the people in Europe and North America. There's a huge difference between Africa, and Ghana is here in the middle. In Sierra Leone, humanitarian aid. Here in Uganda, development aid. Here, time to invest. There you can go for holiday. It's a tremendous variation within Africa, which we very often make that it's equal everything. I can split South Asia here. India is the big bubble in the middle, but huge difference between Afghanistan and Sri Lanka. And I can split Arab states. How are they? Same climate, same culture, same religion, huge difference. Even between neighbors. Yemen, civil war, United Arab Emirates money, which was quite equally and well used. Not as the myth is. And that includes all the children of the foreign workers who are in the country. Data is often better than you think. Many people say that data is bad. There is an uncertainty margin, but we can see the difference here, Cambodia, Singapore. The differences are much bigger than the weakness of the data. East Europe, Soviet economy for a long time, but they come out after 10 years very, very differently. And there is Latin America, Today we don't have to go to Cuba to find a healthy country in Latin America. Chile will have a lower child mortality than Cuba within some few years from now. And here we have high-income countries in OECD, and we get the whole pattern here of the world, which is more or less like this. And if we look at it, how it looks, the world, in 1960, it starts to move, 1960. This is Mao Zedong. He brought health to China. And then he died, and then Deng Xiaoping came and brought money to China and brought them into the mainstream again. And we have seen how countries move in different directions like this. So it's sort of difficult to get an example country which shows the pattern of the world. But I would like to bring you back to about here at 1960, and I would like to compare South Korea, which is this one, with Brazil, which is this one. The label went away for me here. And I would like to compare Uganda, which is there. And I can run it forward like this. And you can see how South Korea is making a very, very fast advancement, whereas Brazil is much slower. And if we move back again here, and we put on trails on them like this, you can see again that the speed of development is very, very different. And the countries are moving more or less in the same rate as money and health. But it seems you can move much faster if you are healthy first than if you are wealthy first. And to show that, you can put on the way of United Arab Emirates. They came from here. A mineral country. They catch all the oil, they got all the money, but health cannot be bought at the supermarket. You have to invest in health. You have to get kids into schooling. You have to train health staff. You have to educate the population. And Sheikh Zayed did that in a fairly good way. And in spite of falling oil prices, he brought this country up here. So we got a much more mainstream appearance of the world, where all countries tend to use their money better than they used in the past. Now, this is more or less if you look at average data of the countries. They are like this. Now, that's dangerous to use average data because there's such a lot of difference within countries. So if I go and look here, we can see that Uganda, that today is where South Korea was 1960. If I split Uganda, there's quite a difference within Uganda. These are the quintiles of Uganda. The richest 20% of Ugandans are there, the poorest are down there. If I split South Africa, it's like this. And if I go down and look at Niger, where there was such a terrible famine lastly, it's like this. The 20% poorest of Niger is out here, and the 20% richest of South Africa is there, and yet we tend to discuss on what solutions there should be in Africa. Everything in this world exists in Africa. And you can't discuss universal access to HIV for that quintile up here with the same strategy as down here. The improvement of the world must be highly contextualized. And it's not relevant to have it on regional level. We must be much more detailed. We find that students get very excited when they can use this. And even more policymakers and the corporate sectors would like to see how the world is changing. Now, why doesn't this take place? Why are we not using the data we have? We have data in the United Nations, in the national statistical agencies, and in universities and other non-governmental organizations, because the data is hidden down in the databases. And the public is there, and the internet is there, but we have still not used it effectively. All that information we saw changing in the world does not include publicly funded statistics. There are some web pages like this, but they take some nourishment down from the databases, but people put prices on them, stupid passwords and boring statistics. And this won't work. So what is needed? We have the databases. It's not a new database you need. We have wonderful design tools, and more are added up here. So we started a non-profit venture, which we called Linking Data to Design. We call it Gapminder, from London Underground, where they warn you, mind the gap. So we thought Gapminder was appropriate. And we started to write software which could link the data like this. And it wasn't that difficult. It took some person years, and we have produced animations. You can take a data set and put it there. We are liberating UN data. Some few UN organizations, some countries accept that their databases can go out on the world. But what we really need is, of course, a search function. A search function where we can copy the data up to a searchable format and get it out in the world. And what do we hear when we go around? I've done anthropology on the main statistical units. Everyone says it's impossible. This can't be done. Our information is so peculiar and detailed, so that cannot be searched as other can be searched. We cannot give the data free to the students, free to the entrepreneurs of the world. But this is what we would like to see, isn't it? The publicly funded data is down here, and we would like flowers to grow out on the net. And one of the crucial points is to make them searchable, and then people can use the different design tool to animate it there. And I have a pretty good news for you. I have a good news that the present new head of UN Statistics, he doesn't say it's impossible. He only says we can't do it. And that's a quite clever guy. Huh? So we can see a lot happening in data in the coming years. We will be able to look at income distributions in completely new ways. This is the income distribution of China, 1970. This is the income distribution of the United States, 1970. Almost no overlap. Almost no overlap. And what has happened? What has happened is this. That China is growing, it's not so equal any longer, and it's appearing here, overlooking the United States, almost like a ghost, isn't it? Huh? It's pretty scary. But I think it's very important to have all this information. We need really to see it. And instead of looking at this, I would like to end up by showing the internet users per 1,000. In this software, we access about 500 variables from all the countries quite easily. It takes some time to change for this, but on the axes, you can quite easily get any variable you would like to have. And the thing would be to get up the databases free, to get them searchable, and with a second click to get them into the graphic formats where you can instantly understand them. Now the statisticians doesn't like it because they say that this will not show the reality. We have to have statistical analytical methods. But this is hypothesis generating. I end now with a world. There the internet are coming, the number of internet users are going up like this. This is the GDP per capita, and it's a new technology coming in, but in amazingly how well it fits to the economy of the countries. That's why the $100 computer will be so important. But it's a nice tendency. It is as if the world is flattening off, isn't it? These countries are lifting more than the economy. And it will be very interesting to follow this over the year, as I would like you to be able to do with all the publicly funded data. Thank you very much.
Okay, before we start our discussion on visual design and Gapminder, right towards the end of the video, he mentioned statisticians have a problem with this because you can't reason analytically and rigorously about the data. He mentioned that Gapminder is not meant for that purpose. It's meant to be hypothesis generating. So he mentions explicitly what the activity is that he's hoping Gapminder supports. Okay, given that activity, what are the various strategies, visual strategies that are built into Gapminder to support this activity? Animation. What about the animation? Why animation? Why not a static image? Trends over time, right? So obviously we're looking not just at health and wealth across the world, but also across time. And animation, which we'll talk about in a moment, brings to life temporal relationships, right? How relationships between health and wealth are themselves changing over time.
Interface is also intuitive.
Sorry?
Interface is also intuitive.
Absolutely, right? It's all slider bars. You don't need to be an expert in global development or statistics to use it. It's meant for the public, right?
Animation also helps with things up categorically, not just technically.
Okay.
It's countries into smaller countries to show categorical relationships.
Absolutely, right? There was a specific point he was making about means and standard deviations, and he used animations to drive home that point. So let's focus on that specific part of Gapminder. There was a point he was trying to make about our tendency to focus on the mean rather than variance. What animation was he using to highlight that? Yep.
I believe it was the part where he broke up the countries into smaller pieces to distribute, or I guess he broke up the continents that were put together into the individual countries.
Exactly, right? So he took the various global regions and then broke them up into their individual countries and then went one level down, right? With the exact same animation, he punctured the country and showed the quintiles, right? The fifths of development and health. Why that particular animation? So he's using animation and then animating that data in a particular way.
Because our original assumptions were based on this split distribution, and so we started off with that really nice looking split distribution with two separate worlds, basically a third world and we.
Exactly, yeah.
And then you brought it back to really the reality is normal distribution, and then how does this logarithmic function look based over its percentile?
Exactly, right? So there's also the cumulative distributions. We'll come back to those in a moment, but let's stick with these, this animation about mean and standard deviation. So he used a particular visual metaphor here. What was it?
I think I thought of it as like a ball that gets like divided into, I don't know, I can't say it intuitively, but almost like a water droplet that splits into smaller droplets, so it's like physically intuitive.
Exactly. I think that's a great description, right? Like it's a water droplet or a bubble that's being burst in some way. What is the metaphor? Why that particular animation? Why bursting something into different regions?
To indicate that there's still parts of the same whole.
There's still parts of the same whole, right?
Shattering a lot of your expectations.
Thank you, right? So there are a lot of English idioms like shatter your expectations or burst your bubble, right? If you actually think about it, he didn't actually mention those English idioms, but hopefully that was what was being called up in your mind, right? He's popping the bubble, right? You look at a country or a region and you see it at a distance with a shell around it, right? We can't see directly the complexities of health and wealth in a distant country at a distant point in time, so we wrap it in a bubble, a mean, right? The average income in Africa is lower than here. Therefore, everyone over there is poorer than here, right? He's popping that bubble and looking inside, right? It's a very, very specific visual metaphor.
I think the most important part of this is actually on cross-line. Because this device could be, and is, online. Most people probably are not using it if and only if they don't have some emotional connection with it.
Right, so he obviously brings this to life, right? So his
jokes, laughter.
storytelling, the humor in it, right? There's an arc. Remember our discussion about engagement last week, right? Drawing, he's trying to draw you in to Gapminder. He's telling a story. There is a beginning, middle, and an end, and he partly developed Gapminder along with his startup for exactly this purpose, right? There is a narrative there. You can play around with Gapminder and not necessarily be going in any particular direction and just explore the data. Not so in this video. What are some of the other aspects of Gapminder? What are some of the other visual tricks that were being used there?
I think the animation and also his performance, like there is a race around the world, so that's
a race, right? So there's also this group of metaphors about the race, China closing in on the US, the developing countries catching up with the developed world, right? They all have to do with things changing in time and different regions changing at different rates over time. That's a relatively complex and abstract concept to get right. We want to understand a relationship between health and wealth in a given country and in another country, then look at how those relationships change over time, and then finally how those two rates compare to one another between countries. It's an actual quite complex series of arguments that are supported by data that he tries to link together with this animation, right? China is closing in the US, right? A little bit of humor, but again, trying to tie all of this information together using visualization.
That made me think
Absolutely, right? So again, assuming you have a little bit of mathematical reasoning and you know what a slope is, there's lots of material in there also for the advanced user. Okay, when you, towards the end of the course, are developing your educational game, you want to be thinking about your users. Your user is partway through using your system, and they ask themselves, where am I and where am I going? How well am I doing so far? Where are my weak points? How am I comparing against other people that have used this system? Am I catching up on them, right? How am I doing? What is my rate of improvement? And how does my rate of improvement compare to other users? There's lots of different ways you could try and visualize or present that information to the user. Again, to support a particular activity, which is to motivate them and incentivize them. Learning can often be a painful process. It's often helped if you can see how you compare to others and how you compare against your own performance in the past. Okay, another interesting thing about this video is, as you saw, was one of the very first TED Talks, and a lot has changed in the last dozen years since this video was taken. Go have a look at Gapminder. Start in 2004 and move forward to today. Do the predictions that are mentioned in this video hold up? It's kind of interesting, right? Hypothesis generation. Hans made a hypothesis from this, a prediction about how things would play out between 2004 and 2015. Was he right? We can see. Okay, I'll leave that for you to think about. Let's move on. As I mentioned in this lecture, we're talking about visual design. We're going to switch from talking about Hans Rosling to another very important person in this field, Edward Tufte. I am going to pass around the first of Tufte's 3 books. This first one is The Visual Display of Quantitative Information. Have a look and pass it along. If you have ambitions to become an HCI designer, or you want to work in industry in terms of interface design, this is probably going to be the first book on your bookshelf. So have a look. We're going to talk about, in the rest of this lecture, we're going to talk about briefly Tufte's 3 books. This first one he described or summarized as pictures of numbers. So this most closely relates to what we just saw in Gapminder. How do we go about visualizing and presenting patterns in data about abstract things, GDP, child mortality? We want to try and support our observers in a particular activity, which is reasoning about abstract concepts. And as we just saw, there's a lot of strategies that you can bring to bear on that problem. We'll then switch to his second book, which is about pictures of nouns or pictures of things. In this case, we're trying to reason about data that is drawn from actual physical objects that exist out there in the world. They have a particular place and a particular time. They have a particular organization of one another in the real world. We want to try and abstract that relationship, but not distort it too much and present it back to the user. And we'll finish today's lecture with visual explanations or pictures of verbs. So we just saw how the rates of change in health and wealth in different countries, how those rates compare to one another. Showing a picture that communicates how things play out over time is a particularly challenging aspect of visual design, and there are different visual tricks that we can bring to bear on that problem. One of the most obvious ones is animation. You might also be interested in his 4th book about PowerPoint. I'm not using PowerPoint, I'm using Google Slides. But it's a very interesting read about how we present information in the modern world influences the way that we think. Kind of a contentious book, but also very interesting. Okay, let's start with pictures of numbers. Obviously, if we have abstract concepts or we have numbers, first thing we think about is a graph, right? A scatter plot, a bar plot, a cumulative distribution. Lots of ways we can do that. We can create a graph and show it to our user. That's perfectly fine. But looking is a passive process, right? If we want our users to be able to generate hypotheses, if we want to support the activity of hypothesis generation, we would like our users to be able to interact with the visualization and the data and to play with the data. right? So with the creation of personal computers, that became possible for the first time, right? There's a very long history of graphic design and scientific visualization, a lot of which is talked about in Tufte's books. But now with apps and slider bars and smartphones, we can and touchscreens, we can interact with the data and play with the data to generate hypotheses and then generate additional observations that support or disprove those hypotheses. And we'll talk about that in a moment. So we can create a picture to generate a hypothesis. It looks interesting. I wonder why China is catching up on the US. I hypothesize it's because of ... We might be able to dive back into the data, manipulate the data to see whether we can find patterns that support or disprove that hypothesis. Okay. This is tricky, however, because again, if we're trying to animate data, we've got a lot of data, the human visual system is limited, right? There's only so much information we can take in at one time. We've mentioned this several times before. How do we maximize the amount of information that we communicate with the minimum of ink? We don't want to confuse our user too much. Let's look at a specific example. As he mentioned at the beginning of his talk, there are 500 health and wealth indicators in Gapminder. There's probably more by now. But we can't plot all 500 axes at once. We can't see in 500 dimensional space. So we pick two. In this case, we have life expectancy, a health indicator on the vertical axis, and GNP, gross national product, or a wealth indicator on the horizontal axis. And in 2004, you can see several things about the relationship between these two variables. But what about population? What about carbon dioxide emissions, tons per capita? How could we elaborate this visualization? How could we add something to it and add as little as possible to help the user to see not only is there a relationship between life expectancy and GNP, but also population and also CO2 emissions? Or to ask the question whether there is a relationship between those 3 or 4 variables. Any ideas? How might we go about doing that without overwhelming our observer?
One could be definitely placed on top. You just have a graphic that follows it. You don't have labels.
What do you mean by on top? You
So
mean up here?
If there's an object that's moving on its superposition based on 2 points, and you can add a label that indicates one of the variables.
We could. So we've got 2 variables, and those variables are becoming the 2 dimensions in our 2-dimensional plot. So we could add a 3rd dimension, which is a label, right? We've already used up size and which global region the country belongs to using color. So we actually do have a 3rd and 4th variable already being shown here. So we're already kind of crowded for space. Where do we go from here?
Maybe just the naive thing to do would be to set a threshold where they start to group together.
Okay.
And the background of the plot actually changes color to reflect the group image population.
That's an interesting idea. We could start to color the background, right? At the moment, the background is all white. Assuming that the countries start to group together, maybe we could put we could color some of these regions in the background with different colors that represent population or CO2 emissions. It's a good idea. Yep.
You could add another feature to each point, before you had a visualization where the inner color was one thing and the outer color was something else. So I don't know if you call it a halo or something, but yeah, you could decompose all these points into multiple points. Maybe the outer ring, its width is proportional to how much emissions.
Exactly.
You see a trend by growing size of the outer ring.
Absolutely, right? And as you would probably expect, the more developed countries here in terms of GNP, countries that are further to the right, so you can probably imagine they're bigger polluters, or at least they were in 2004, right? So you would expect points that move further to the right have thicker rings around them if the thickness of the ring represents amount of CO2 emissions, right? That's the right idea. We're altering the visualization of the dots rather than doing something like adding a 3rd dimension. We could add a 3rd dimension, just put CO2 emissions as a third dimension and turn this 2D plot into a 3D plot. What's the problem with that?
It's just really tricky to visualize in 2 dimensions. So 3-dimensional plots is notorious for just being horrible to interpret.
3D plots are notorious for being horrible to interpret. Why? What is it about the human visual system that has a hard time with 3D plots?
Because the screen is a 2D and our main input is 2D.
Exactly, right? So we've got a 2D screen and you can fake a 3D plot. Hard for the visual system to deal with. Plus, just the nature of 3D, some points are going to be occluded by others, right? Not in an informative manner as when we did these time series trajectories where occlusion meant something. Now it's just literally an obstruction, right? So 3D is maybe not the way to go. We could put some background color. We could add rings to the circles. If we want to keep going, we want to add a 4th and a 5th and a 6th variable, which gets really tricky. And admittedly, this is adding a fair bit more ink. We can continue our metaphor here. We're plotting pairs of variables. So remember our discussion last week about conceptual consistency. Once somebody learns how to read a Gapminder panel, we could add another panel, and this might be difficult to see. So I'll just talk you through this. We have GNP on the horizontal axis here, and we have GNP down here, and we have life expectancy on the vertical axis here. This is our original plot. We're going to add a second plot, and that second plot is going to have the same horizontal axis, GNP and GNP. And because they have the same horizontal axis, we're going to line them up vertically. So there's a bit of redundant data here. So you should be able to see that China has the same horizontal position in both plots, because we're plotting the same data. GNP for China in 2004, same thing with the United States. And we've now freed up a little bit more real estate to add a third dimension here, which is child mortality. So up here, more child deaths per woman. Down here, less childbirths per woman. Just looking at these two panels, what is the relationship between GNP, life expectancy, and child mortality? Or is there one? This is a pretty tricky thing to do, right? We're trying to reason about pairwise relationships between more than a pair of variables.
Child mortality and life expectancy seem to be inversely related.
Absolutely.
Where they're positively correlate with GDP.
Correct, right. So one pair of variable is positively correlated and a second pair is anti-correlated, which you can see pretty easily by saccading back and forth between these images. It's getting a little bit tricky though. This is known as a rug plot because we're attaching these panels or rugs. Between the panels, we're going to plot the data that they share in common, which in this case is GNP. And that gives us, between the two panels, a one-dimensional projection. We're projecting just down onto a single variable, GNP. What can you tell me about just GNP by just looking at the quote-unquote threads between the rugs?
They kind of into 3 groups.
Exactly, right? It is not a uniform distribution. They're clumping somehow, right? Which again is this question about, is there a developed and developing world? Whatever it is, at least in 2004, it was definitely not uniform, right? So there's additional information here, if we just look at these two, not just the pairwise comparisons between 3 variables, but also some information about the distribution of one of those 3 variables. We're starting now to try and communicate a lot of information. We can continue this, obviously, by adding new panels or rugs. So in this case, we're now plotting on the horizontal axis over here, CO2 emissions. So we can now, if you're really paying attention, start to reason about pairwise relationships between 4 variables. You can keep going, it gets pretty difficult, right? Okay. This strategy has pros and cons. Again, it depends on what our users are trying to do. Assuming that they're trying to see relationships between as many of the variables in Gapminder as possible at the same time, a rug plot may be the way to go. It's a difficult thing to do. Okay. These are just different strategies that we can think about. All right, let's switch away from Gapminder for a moment. Way back in 2007 and 2008 was the onset of the global recession. How might we go about plotting that period? What happened during that time? We could use Gapminder again and plot wealth indicators and see all the trajectories start to drop periodically between 2008 and a few years ago. Is there some structure, if we think just about economic data, thinking about economic sectors, companies, different sectors of the economy, how might we represent that data and how the economy changed over this period?
I've got a break from what you're saying. I can't ignore the econometer is static.
So
in the visualization you originally presented the econometer and
yep.
you were doing research on it.
Yes.
You could see easily static in a recession from 2007 and beyond. You easily see the same static forming right now.
Okay. Okay. Maybe that's so. There we're generating a hypothesis right now, right?
2011 is when they had unlimited tranche opportunities, which is the same investments that crashed last time.
This was probably not the last recession for sure. All right. Okay. So we have a particular activity in mind. We would like to understand how things changed in the economy during this period. What visualizations might we start to create to support that activity? Any ideas? Crystal?
You could have some kind of animation to show the number of people taking part-time jobs versus full-time.
Okay, so we could formulate certain variables we want to measure, right? Part-time versus full-time employment. We could do the standard trick about the ticker tape, right? You know, there's obvious economic indicators. But what happens if we want to look at this data at different levels of organization? We want to look at the global economy, the American economy, different sectors of the American economy, and different companies within those different sectors, and how their fortunes waxed and waned over this period. So we're not, like we just saw in Gapminder, we're trying to resist the temptation to put everything in a bubble which just moves up and down over time on a horizontal axis. We want to burst that bubble and see the highly hierarchical nature of economic data. One way we can do this is using a different kind of visualization called a tree map. Tree maps are kind of interesting, and they're designed to represent hierarchical data. So, as I mentioned, the first time I taught this course was actually in spring 2007, and we were talking about this exactly as the economy was coming online.
I know that site.
Yes. So this is an old version of it. The most recent version is at FinViz. You can go and play around with this if you like. So when I was making these slides, that was the picture 2 days before the class. This was the picture the next day, the day before the class, when things started to go south. What is this data representing? As usual, and for those that know this visualization well, remember we're trying to play the game of looking at a novel way of visualizing data, and luckily we don't have to read pages of a manual to parse what's going on here. What hints does the visualization itself give you about what's being represented here?
You see different sectors as healthcare, financial, energy.
So what are the sectors? Which visual construct here is representing sectors?
The gray outline.
Yeah, the gray boxes around.
Exactly. So the large gray boxes represent sectors, and as you can imagine, the box itself is the American economy in this case. What else?
I assume they're supposed to do with some sort of volume.
Pretty good guess, right? The size of the rectangle, most people would guess would be the volume of trading or size of the sector, right? What do the smaller boxes inside each sector represent?
market share of a specific company?
Of a specific company, right? So the smallest rectangles that you see here represent different companies. None of the companies are labeled. This is a snapshot from 2007, so Twitter's not on here. What are your guesses? Anyone want to take a guess at what some of these rectangles represent? If you get a visualization right, it's amazing how well guesswork works.
Technology, you probably have Microsoft.
Where's technology here?
Yeah, to the left.
To the left. Possibly. These, it might be difficult to see, these are two different boxes, two different colors, two different boxes. Yeah, I'm sorry, the contrast on this is not very good. It's a little hard to see.
I guess the communication, there's two green, one is AT&T and maybe another.
Correct. One of them is AT&T and the other one is, I don't know, what is it? What's the other big one at that time? I don't know, I can't keep track. Okay, all right, so we're looking at a tree, right, where the root of the tree is the box, and then we're going one level down in the tree to individual sectors, down into individual companies, and we're stopping at that level of detail. We could go down one more level if you were feeling ambitious. What would be the level below that you could add to this tree map? Within company division, what might you want to represent there? How might you burst the bubble or box of one of these companies and represent something about the internal structure of that company?
Somehow display like the range of incomes between the employees.
Okay, the range of incomes of employees, we could do that. That is unlikely to, income is unlikely to change from one day to the next. It's a perfectly good thing to do, but it might not support what we're trying to do, which is visualize the recession. So now we're picking specific aspects of within company structure that we might add to our visualization to help the observer understand what's going on. Number of employed, okay, we could also do that. And that also does not change from one day to the next. If we're plotting it over months or years, maybe yes. This plot, if you have a look here, we're actually plotting daily data. This is change in the company's fortunes in one day.
Is it like stock market value?
Could be, that is exactly what the color is representing. So the red and green have something to do, obviously, with value. What?
Going up and down.
Up and down, right? So the company's a little bit more valuable today than it was yesterday. What details about intra-corporate structure, within corporate structure, changes from day to day and might be useful for someone to see who's trying to understand the repercussions of the oncoming recession day by day?
As stocks dive, you might see like companies consolidating with each other. So like certain sections might combine into a larger company.
Yep, that's a great idea. We might have two companies that come together, but again, that usually plays out over weeks or months. But inside a company, there might be consolidations and changes in departments. There might be HR restructuring that's going on inside a company that might be relevant to the recession.
Question.
Yep.
March 3rd is Saturday.
I don't remember. I have to go back and look. It is? Oh, okay.
So when this move black either way?
On Friday?
On Saturday?
Will it go?
Friday.
This is Friday. This is what happened on Friday.
Thanks for reeling me in.
There you go. Okay. So we probably didn't have this back in 2007, but for a lot of companies, they track obviously who's buying their products and services from day to day. Might be interesting to add smaller rectangles that represent the most popular products and services, various products and services sold by a single company, and show how those are going red and green. So on any given day here, I think this is Microsoft down here. Microsoft wasn't doing very well, but what about the products? Were there certain products that were being sold and bought more or less on this day compared to previous days or weeks?
Probably like alcohol and tobacco.
Possibly.
Good sector would be very
possibly, right? So yeah, exactly. You can see that there actually are some a few very red and also some very green companies here. Interesting to formulate hypotheses and reason about them, which again you can do by going and checking out FinViz there. So a very different visualization compared to what we just saw in Gapminder, which is designed for a different problem. Reasoning about change over time in a hierarchical system. Economy, sectors, companies, individual products and services within that company, and so on. Okay, let's move on to pictures of nouns. So most of what we've been focusing so far is bringing to life abstract concepts. Now we're going to try and represent many nouns, as Tufte said, lying on the ground, right? So I want to make a visualization of you all when you come to class, right? Obviously you tend to sit in the same place. There are relative positions between you. In pictures of nouns, we're usually talking about maps or networks somehow. We're trying to create a correspondence between the actual spatial organization out in the real world among the objects of interest and the spatial organization in our virtual representation of those objects. That correspondence does not have to be perfect, and it usually cannot be perfect. Why can it not be perfect? Why can't we create a one-to-one correspondence between physical organization, spatial organization, and virtual spatial organization?
I mean, if you're making one of this room, it would be as big as this room.
Exactly. I make a map of this room. The map is as big as this room. That would, if I want to do a one-to-one correspondence. So there's an obvious warping that's built into pretty much every map you can imagine, which is map not to scale. Right? That is one of many, many possible abstractions and transformations that you might apply to spatial organization. And which warping or change you apply, as always, depends on what your observer is trying to do. What activity are they trying to carry out by looking at your map? Question?
Were you the one who showed us the, or I saw someone else with the tube?
Don't steal my example. All right. You're going to see Mind the Gap from Gapminder. So the London Underground shows up twice in this lecture. Here's a picture of the London Underground, and I'll make things slightly easier on you by maximizing this. If you're a London native or you're very familiar with the London Underground, please excuse yourself from the following exercise. I want you to figure out on the tube how to get from Borough Station in the bottom right there to Warwick Avenue in the top left using the tube. Go ahead and plot out your route. I'll give you a minute or so to do that. This is Google. This is Google Maps. You are using Google. You are using Google. How many people think they found the optimal route? No? You found a route. Welcome to the London Underground, yes. Okay, before you give me your answer, what actually are you doing? I told you vaguely what to do, which is to get from red to purple.
I would say some version of Dijkstra's algorithm.
And Dijkstra's algorithm does what?
Well, it takes like nodes from a graph theory problem.
Yep.
Move from node to node to see the optimal path.
So it finds the optimal path, right? So you're hopefully inferred that I asked you not really to find a path. That's a good place to start. But really, you want to find the optimal path. But what do we mean by optimal path? Dijkstra's algorithm has a very specific measurement of optimal path. Think about the activity here. What is the optimal path?
I would say that like you're ideally looking for the fewest number of transfers between trains, because like you could go all the way up north and like jump between 4 different lines, but that's huge pain for an actual commute. So
Exactly.
you want like the one train you can get on that will take you the whole way.
Exactly. So there's a lot of hidden context when you're navigating the London Underground, or performing any mode of travel, right? Walking to your next class compared to getting from point A to point B in London, they're both travel exercises, but they're very different. And some of those aspects of context are obvious. I'd like it not to take forever. But there are a growing number of them that become increasingly subtle. So one step down is, I'm not looking for the shortest path. I'm looking for the shortest number of switches, the least switches. What is it? Anybody figured it out yet?
I thought down in this kind of black line from the red down to the kind of coppery one, and then just taking that straight to the blue.
The black down to the coppery one, the brown line, the Waterloo line. Looks good, right? One switch. Is there a path that requires no change in train? Hard to say, actually, right? Let's try again. Right? One of the most famous visualizations in the history of visual design is the map of the London Underground. And now you know why it's so famous. Is there a path that requires no switching? Hands up if you think there's a path that requires no switching, given the information shown here. No? So we found the optimal path, or at least we found one of the optimal paths, right? What is it about the map of the London Underground that simplifies plotting of routes and finding easily the optimal route?
It eliminates other layers on the map.
It eliminates, right? We're trying to maximize data to ink ratio. Sometimes that means adding data, like we saw in the rug plot example. Sometimes it means removing ink, right? One of the geniuses of the London Underground map is the removal of unnecessary ink. Yep.
The lines are also more standardized, so you don't have, wiggly paths. You have just that 45-degree angle.
Exactly. The lines are standardized, right? So either horizontal, vertical, or 45. Why? Why is that simplification legal in this task?
It's just easier to follow.
Easier to follow, but we've thrown away a lot of information, right? Obviously, the tracks, the tunnels don't actually move along these three lines. So why was it okay to throw away that information?
Because you're in the train.
You get who cares, right? When you're on the tube, you don't care, right? It depends on what you're trying to do, right? If you're very susceptible to seasickness, maybe you do care about, the twists and turns in the tunnel, but for most people, the only thing they care about is how to get from point A to point B with the minimum number of switching. What other aspects of this map, what other irrelevant information is being thrown away and why?
Well, it makes it really clear which stations service which lines, whereas on the other map, it's not always clear. It might be that one line crosses with another line, but there's not a station there.
Exactly. If you look carefully, there are a lot of lines that actually go through a station but don't stop at the station. Also very important to know for this task.
Distance between stations?
What about distance between stations?
Thrown away.
Is thrown away. So this actually makes it difficult if you're trying to get from point A to point B in a combination of walking and the London Underground. Now things get really tricky. Something that looks short in this map ends up being far, and something that looks far on the map ends up being short. There's also some additional information that's added here beyond what's here that also helps support the context of traveling on the tube. What is it?
The 1, 2, 3, 4 in the background?
Yep.
Yeah.
What do they mean?
Busy area and rural area.
Okay, so that you can see that there are these zones radiating out from the center. It doesn't actually say, I don't think on this map, what those zones represent. They may represent congestion. It's not actually what they represent. Congestion, at least auto traffic, we don't care because we're on the tube. What aspect of these zones radiating from the center outward might we care about? And we might want to know whether a particular station is in zone 1 in the center or 2 on the periphery.
Are they fare zones?
Fare zones, right? I want to get from point A to point B as cheaply as possible. So this is actually a multi-objective optimization problem. I'm trying to optimize my route against two variables, number of switch points and cost of travel. For most travel in London, it's a relatively trivial task, but for some others, not so obvious. This is meant to try and help you perform that task at a moment's glance as you're commuting or traveling. Okay. Again, there's lots you can read about the history of this particular map if you're particularly interested in visual design. Okay, let's move on to the third one. This one is particularly challenging. There are some cases where we want to bring to life verbs, things that are causing change or being changed over time, cause and effect. A lot of times we want to use an animation, which makes things simpler, but sometimes we want to create a snapshot of change over time. What are some common strategies to convey motion or change over time with an unchanging image? What are some of the most obvious things we could do?
Add some lines behind you, indicate you are moving this way.
Okay, so like in Gapminder, we can add trajectories. That's one common strategy. What else?
In the reading from Tuesday, like the movement of the troops was kind of like assumed, so then the size of the army was what we were looking at.
Exactly. So if you go back and look at the reading from Tuesday and for today, it's this march of an army over a map, right? So the actual position of the army is shown like the London Underground on a map, but they cheat a little bit. The width of the trajectory is the size of the army when it reached that point. So it's kind of borrowing the X and Y coordinates on the ground to represent additional information, which is size of the army. And by looking at how the width changes as the army marched, you can see the attrition rate in the army over that period. We just looked at economic data, and a common way to visualize economic data is with the quote-unquote ticker tape. What strategies does the ticker tape use to communicate change over time? It does, I guess you could say it has a tail. The width of the line doesn't mean anything in a ticker tape. You could add width to communicate additional information. What is the strategy being used there? How is change over time visualized in a ticker tape figure? Slope. What's being plotted in slope of what? What versus what? Current price versus prior price, right? And price is usually on the vertical axis, and on the horizontal axis you have time, right? I want to plot a variable versus time, make time one of your axes, right? Very common strategy. Okay, let's have a look at a particular example. This is just a snapshot from an experiment I was part of a long time ago, and part of that experiment had as part of it a pendulum. Here's the pendulum. It's not a very exciting pendulum. First thing you probably want to know about a pendulum is the angle of the arm relative to vertical. So we got one variable which is going to be, I'm going to plot in degrees. And the other variable that we care about is degrees per second, right? Radial velocity, if you like. So we've got degrees per second down here. During this animation, the angle of the arm is changing. What about angle per second? Is velocity also changing? It's also changed. So we've got two variables that we care about, angle and angular velocity, and both are changing over time. We could create, again, an animation where we show angle and somehow represent angular velocity. This is basically that animation. How well can you understand the relationship between angle and angular velocity by looking at that animation? It's the easiest way to plot data that changes over time with an animation, but it is not supporting our activity, which is to understand how angle and angular velocity change. We'll look at one more slide here. We're going to do a ticker tape. So we've got time on the horizontal axis. We have two variables that are changing over time that we care about. Angle and angular velocity. Tell me about angle and angular velocity. How are they changing over time? What can you tell me about those two variables that was almost impossible to see in the previous video, or more difficult to see?
They're both approaching zero?
They're both approaching zero, right? As you would imagine, the arm will eventually come to rest, so we can see that angle is becoming less and angular velocity is becoming less.
And as a result, you can see a change in frequency.
You can see a change in frequency. Lots of things going on here. Okay, you have a guest lecturer on Tuesday, and he will continue from this point. You have a quiz due tonight. You're working on deliverable 4. I will see you next Thursday.